Hello there, my sleep fellows. Tonight, I invite you to rest your weary thoughts and step once more into the enchanted world where whispers of magic drift gently like autumn leaves, and time moves not in hurried ticks, but in slow, thoughtful chimes. Let your imagination glide softly past the stone corridors and twinkling lights of a place you may know well. Hogwarts may be behind us, but its magic is never too far. Tonight's tale begins not in the bustling days of Harry Potter's youth, nor in the heart of some dangerous duel, but in the quiet that follows a life already lived with bravery. You see, even after the final battle, after Voldemort had fallen and the wizarding world had begun to heal, Harry continued to live, as one does, in a world where ordinary days are peppered with extraordinary echoes. But what happens when the magic doesn't quite behave? This is the story of a curious little incident, a mystery, really, set just a few years after Harry left the castle for good. A time when the world had grown calm, and so had he. Yet, one evening, something changed. Not a loud bang, not a dangerous duel, just a gentle, peculiar event. A wand that refused to obey. So, if you're cozy beneath your blankets, with a soft pillow beneath your head, and if your heart is open to stories where mystery tiptoes in rather than bursts through the door, then this is the tale for you. Before we begin, my dear dreamers, if you find comfort in these magical journeys, do consider joining us again, like subscribe or simply return when the stars next call you to Hogwarts. There's always a seat by the fireplace here, waiting just for you. Now, let's return to where our story takes root. It was a mellow evening in Godric's Hollow. The sun was folding itself gently behind the hills, painting the sky in sleepy tones of rose and honey gold. Leaves rustled like parchment whispers outside the window of a small cottage tucked among the hedges. Inside, the home was peaceful, books stacked here and there, a tea kettle humming softly, and Harry, now older, but not old, sitting quietly by a glowing fireplace. He wasn't in aura robes anymore, just a cozy jumper, slightly frayed at the sleeves. A pair of round spectacles still perched on his nose, though they sat a little lower now, as if they, too, had grown comfortable with age. Hedwig, alas, was gone, but her memory lived in the white feathers framed above the mantel, and on the table before him lay his wand, holly and phoenix feather, unchanged for decades. Faithful, true, until tonight. For in a few quiet moments, as he reached for it absent-mindedly to light a candle, something odd would begin. A flicker, a delay, and then something even stranger. But let's not rush. The candle is not yet lit. The room is still, and the wand, it waits, and so do we. Let the quiet begin, let the tale unfold, and let sleep come softly as the magic stirs once more. Harry James Potter, once the boy who lived, and later the man who saved the wizarding world, now lived a life far more ordinary than most would have imagined. His days were no longer filled with duels and dark magic. Instead, they drifted softly between fatherhood, quiet evenings, and warm cups of tea shared with Ginny on the back porch of their home in Godric's Hollow. Though his scar no longer burned, and the weight of the world had eased from his shoulders, there remained in Harry a quiet watchfulness, a habit born of too many battles, of trusting too few and loving too deeply. He often smiled easily now, especially at his children, but behind those green eyes there was still a touch of distant thunder, like a storm remembered even when the skies had long cleared. Ginny, bright as ever, had not dulled with time. She wrote for the Daily Prophet now, her words sharp, witty, and respected across the wizarding world. Her laugh still lit up a room like it had when they were teenagers at the Burrow, and her fierce loyalty was as steady as the roots of an ancient tree. She could tell when Harry was overthinking, often nudging him out of his silence with a simple, knowing look. Then there was Ron, still tall, still a bit clumsy, and still one of the most loyal friends anyone could ask for. He had grown into a man who valued peace over pride, working at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes with George, while spending his weekends helping Hermione with ministry campaigns for magical rites. His hair had grayed slightly at the temples, though he liked to pretend it was just sunstreaks. Hermione Granger Weasley, now a high-ranking official in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, was as brilliant as ever. She juggled magical policy reform, mothering 2 children, and Ron's missing socks with the same precision she once applied to arithmancy charts. Yet despite her busy life, she always made time to visit Harry, usually armed with books, theories, or news from the ministry. Of course, there was Teddy Lupin, no longer the blue-haired toddler clinging to Andromeda's robes, but a young adult in training to become a healer. He often visited the Potters, especially when James, Albus, and Lily were home from Hogwarts. Teddy adored Harry, not as a savior, but as a godfather who had always been there. The children, James, Albus, and Lily, each bore pieces of Harry and Ginny within them. James, the mischief maker, took after his grandfather and uncles. Albus, thoughtful and often pensive, reminded Harry too much of himself, and Lily, clever and strong-willed, had a sparkle in her eye that matched Ginny's exactly. Yes, life had become gentler, but within this quiet circle of family and friendship, the embers of magic still glowed, warm, familiar, and steady. Until one day, the familiar faltered, and it would begin, as all oddities do, in the smallest way possible, with a flick of a wand that didn't flick back. The evening had settled over the countryside, like a warm quilt stitched with stars. In the quiet village of Ottery St. Catchpole, familiar rooftops slumbered under velvet skies. The Burrow, home to so many cherished memories, flickered gently with golden light from within, just enough to guide a wayfarer back home. From inside, the faint sound of a kettle beginning to hum and a soft crackle from the hearth whispered that all was well. Harry Potter, now older and far removed from the hurried days of fighting dark forces, sat comfortably on the mismatched sofa in the Burrow's lounge, his socked feet stretched out toward the fire. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon, parchment, and well-used spell books. On his lap rested a tattered volume titled Mystical Malfunctions of Magical Instruments, which he wasn't actually reading, just absently holding while his mind wandered. The children had been tucked into bed upstairs. James, Lily, and Albus had all insisted on a bedtime story from Uncle Ron, which meant it would be a very loud and slightly exaggerated tale involving a dragon and at least one pair of singed trousers. Ginny had retired early with a cup of honey tea, and Hermione was still deep in conversation with Arthur in the workshop, talking about enchanted gears or something delightfully obscure. Harry sighed, letting the warmth of the room settle into his bones. For once, there were no urgent owls, no mysterious prophecies, no dark wizards to outsmart. Just peace. And yet, as peace often does, it stirred something beneath the surface. A sudden soft pulse tickled Harry's wand hand. It wasn't painful, just odd, as though the wand was stretching itself from within, like a cat waking from a nap. Harry frowned slightly and looked down at his wand, which lay resting beside the book. 11 inches of holly and phoenix feather, this wand had once chosen him. It had been through battles and reconciliations, repaired and rebonded. They had shared victories, heartaches, and the final duel that ended it all. It had always obeyed, fluid, intuitive, familiar. But tonight it felt different. Not dangerous, not dark, just distant. Lumos, Harry murmured softly. Nothing. He blinked. Strange. Lumos, he repeated again, this time with the slightest edge of curiosity. Still nothing. The wand stayed as still and silent as a sleeping twig. Harry lifted it, turning it in his hand. It didn't feel broken. The core still hummed faintly with residual magic, like a heartbeat buried deep in old wood. He narrowed his eyes and leaned back, thoughtful. All right then, he chuckled under his breath, keeping the moment light. Feeling a bit shy, are you? But the wand didn't flicker, didn't glow, didn't even warm to his touch. Harry set the book aside and stood up, slowly moving toward the window. The moonlight poured gently onto the lawn outside, where gnomes rustled in the bushes and an old garden spade leaned against the shed. All looked as it should. He tried again. Lumos. Nothing. Perhaps, he said softly to himself, we're due for a visit to Ollivanders. Just then, there was a shift, not in the air, but within the wand itself. A low vibration, like a tremor of emotion, rippled through the handle and traveled up Harry's fingers. And then, ever so faintly, he heard a whisper. It wasn't in English. It wasn't in words. It was more like a hum, or a tone so old it couldn't be spoken aloud. He looked down at the wand again. Had he imagined it? Harry, ever the seeker of reason, took a deep breath. He wasn't tired. He wasn't overworked. This wasn't one of those strange magical illnesses Ron joked about, like wand hiccups or core confusion. Something was happening, but it wasn't malicious. It was ancient. He stepped into the kitchen quietly, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. He drew a small parchment and wrote a quick note to Ginny, just in case she woke and found him gone, wand being fussy. Stepping outside for a bit. Don't worry. H. He tucked it under her mug. Then, with practiced ease, Harry slipped on his cloak and stepped out into the cool garden. The night greeted him kindly, with a gentle breeze and the rustling hush of sleeping fields. He held the wand up again. "Point me," he whispered, intending for the wand to guide him north. But instead of pointing north, it gently rotated in his hand and pulled west. Harry frowned but allowed it. He let the wand guide his steps, not forcefully, but insistently, like a friend tugging you down a different path for a reason they aren't quite ready to explain. He followed, out past the swing, through the arching line of apple trees, beyond the gate that once squeaked with every push. The wand guided him toward the old field where the Weasleys had once hosted garden Quidditch tournaments. Now overgrown and still, it shimmered faintly with moonlight and dew. There, near the old tree stump, the wand stopped vibrating. Harry paused. The night seemed to hold its breath. The stars leaned in. "Are you trying to tell me something?" he whispered. This time, the wand flickered once, not with light, but with memory. A feeling rushed into him, a soft pulse of recollection, as if the wand itself had remembered something he had long forgotten. A younger Harry, sitting cross-legged with Ron and Hermione, practicing spells beside this very stump. Their laughter, the misfires, the tiny floating pebbles, and then the memory changed. Not his own, someone else's. An older boy, unknown to Harry, once sat in the same spot, holding a wand made of holly. Not his, but similar, practicing in secret, a spell long lost, a failure followed by a soft apology to the wand itself. Then silence again. The vision ended as gently as it began. Harry stood still, the wand now warm in his hand. It had shared something, a memory, a message, a clue. He didn't know yet, but what he did know was this. His wand hadn't refused to obey out of mischief or malfunction. It had chosen to pause, to remember, to show, and in that pause a new mystery had quietly begun to unfold, one wrapped not in danger, but in forgotten friendships and echoes from long ago. Harry turned back toward the house, the grass cool beneath his feet, the wand resting quietly by his side. Whatever this was, it would unfold in its own time, and Harry would be ready to listen. The next morning unfolded like a parchment, unrolling under soft candlelight. The mist clung to the windows of Harry's small cottage on the edge of the forbidden forest, the same mist that had caressed the trees the night before. The fireplace whispered its quiet song of warmth, and the scent of cinnamon toast wafted gently through the air. Crookshanks stretched on the rug, purring as though he had solved all the mysteries of the world in his sleep. Harry stirred slowly, his thoughts still wrapped in the fog of last night's strange encounter, the wand refusing his charm, the unexpected sparks, the silence that had followed. He sat up in bed, the covers pooling around his waist, and looked over at the wand resting on the nightstand. It seemed perfectly normal now. In fact, it looked just as it always had, polished, familiar, unwavering. But Harry knew better. He picked it up again. The wood was warm in his hand, as it had always been, but something had changed in the way it settled into his palm. Where once it had felt like an extension of his very spirit, now it felt like a guest, present, but unsure of its welcome. He tried a small charm again, whispering, "Lumos, The tip glowed gently. He let out a soft breath, not quite relief, but something like it. Still, the unease lingered, like a shadow behind a curtain. He knew what he had to do. As the sun lifted higher, painting golden streaks across the sky, Harry made his way down to the small library nook he had created, a corner lined with bookshelves, teacups, and parchment scraps. He pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal, not his own, but Dumbledore's, a copy gifted to him after the war by Professor McGonagall, filled with notes, musings, and half-finished thoughts the late headmaster had never shared aloud. He flipped carefully through the pages until he came across a passage scribbled in faded blue ink. Wands, though loyal, are not static. They remember, they evolve. Should a wizard grow distant from their core purpose, the wand may seek a new rhythm, a reattunement. Harmony is earned, not assumed. Harry stared at those words. His fingers brushed the lines again, more thoughtfully this time. What had changed in him since the war, since Voldemort's end, since the last cry of battle? He had lived gently. No more confrontations, no grand heroics. He had tried to be just Harry, gardener, friend, sometimes a quiet advisor to the ministry when asked, but mostly a man at rest. Could it be that his wand no longer recognized this version of him? He set the journal down and stepped outside. The morning air was brisk, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. The world felt older here, as though time passed more slowly in this corner of the forest. Trees swayed softly, their leaves whispering among themselves in a language only ancient beings remembered. Harry walked, wand in hand, not trying to cast anything now, just listening, observing. As he rounded a bend near the brook where owls sometimes nested, a strange shimmer caught his eye. It hovered just above the forest floor, like sunlight refracting through water, except no Zukuta was there. It danced and wavered, then suddenly spun into a spiral and collapsed inward. And then it opened. A doorway, standing free with no frame and no hinges, just an arch of light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Harry stepped closer, and the air changed. It wasn't cold or hot, but charged with a kind of memory, as if the trees around him were watching, waiting. He held out his wand and spoke gently. Alohomora. Nothing. Revelio. Still nothing. But then, the wand in his hand pulsed, just once, a tiny vibration, like a sigh, and the doorway responded. It shimmered again, then opened wider. Harry stepped through. What he saw on the other side was not another place, not truly. It was a moment, a preserved memory. The forbidden forest, yes, but not as it was now. No mist, no morning bird song. Instead, he saw himself, much younger, walking beside Hagrid, laughing, carrying a glowing lantern through the darkness. Buckbeak swooped gently overhead. It was a memory pulled from the forest itself, drawn out like thread from a tapestry. The wand hummed again in his hand, and Harry realized it wasn't broken. It wasn't misbehaving. It was remembering. He stepped back out, the arch closing silently behind him. The clearing was unchanged, and yet Harry felt different, lighter, as though he had touched something sacred. Returning home, He placed the wand on the wooden table and sat in silence for a long while. Crookshanks curled up beside him. The fire crackled gently. Then, for no reason he could explain, Harry whispered, "Do you still choose me?" The wand glowed softly, just a quiet flicker at its tip, a pulse of light, then stillness again, and Harry, with a small, grateful smile, nodded. Whatever had happened, it wasn't a punishment. It was a transition, a remembering, a soft nudge from the magical world that harmony required presence, and presence required care. That night, as the stars winked above the treetops, Harry dreamed of spells cast by candlelight, of wands resting gently in their velvet-lined boxes, of days long past and new days still to come. And somewhere in the forest, the shimmer of a hidden doorway blinked into existence once more, just for a moment, then faded like a breath in the wind. The days that followed the shimmering doorway passed like dream-laced hours, soft and meandering. A hush settled over Harry's world, not of dread, but of gentle pause, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. He found himself moving slower, listening more, as though each sound or flicker of light carried meaning just beneath the surface. Every morning, he woke with the mist curling around his windows like old parchment scrolls, and every evening he watched the sun melt behind the pines in colors he swore he hadn't noticed before: lavender, honey gold, velvet blue. He wasn't certain if the forest was changing or if he was simply seeing it through different eyes. The wand, though quiet now, remained a companion by his side. It had not misbehaved again. No rogue sparks, no stubborn silences, but still it waited, as if observing him, as if deciding. Harry spent long hours in the garden, his hands in the earth, planting tiny glowing seedlings gifted to him by Neville during his last visit. Some bloomed only at night, like little moons unfolding from soil. Others gave off soft warmth, like miniature hearths hidden in petals. He liked tending to them. There was a peace in the rhythm. Dig, water, hum a little tune. He felt more grounded than he had in years. But something in the air had changed. It began with the dreams. They came slowly, one night at a time, fragments at first. A clock with no hands, a room with floating candles that flickered in reverse, dripping wax upward. The soft sound of someone whispering his name, but always from just beyond the veil of sleep. And always, the wand, hovering in his dreams, not in his hand, but floating, still, uncertain, watching one evening, as twilight painted the trees in gentle plum and rose. Harry sat by the fire, sipping a steaming cup of chamomile. A book lay open on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in nearly an hour. His mind was adrift. Crookshanks stirred beside him, ears perking. That's when it happened. A knock at the door. Not loud, not urgent, just curious. Harry rose slowly, wand in hand, not out of fear but reflex. When he opened the door, no one was there, just the forest path, quiet and mist-swept, the sky deepening above in soft shades of indigo. But at his feet was a letter, sealed in wax. He bent and picked it up. The seal wasn't familiar, not Hogwarts, not the Ministry. It was older, a small crescent moon encircled by stars, hand-drawn, slightly imperfect. He stepped back inside and opened it gently, the paper soft like old leaves. Inside, the message read, "Come to the clearing where memories dwell. Bring the wand. Come alone." No signature, no trace of magic on the parchment, no enchantments to trace, just those 9 words nestled in a looping hand. Harry stared at the fire for a long time. Should he go? His wand was silent, almost contemplative in his hand. He stood. By the time he reached the path to the clearing, the same place where the shimmering arch had appeared, night had nearly blanketed the forest, but it was a soft night. No howls, no threat, just the sounds of crickets tuning their instruments and leaves whispering bedtime tales. When he arrived, the clearing looked the same, except in the center stood a single chair, wooden, simple, worn, and beside it, floating just above the grass, was a wand. Not his. Older, carved with swirling runes and notched with time. Harry approached, his own wand pulsing lightly in his fingers. And then he saw her, a woman seated in the chair, wrapped in a midnight blue cloak. Her eyes were closed, but she smiled as though she had been waiting a very long time. "Hello, Harry," she said gently, eyes opening. They were silver, not like a reflection, but like moonlight resting on water. "Do I know you?" he asked softly. "In a way," she said, rising with the grace of an old tree bending toward the wind. "I am what you might call a guardian of wand lore, of echoes, of memory." Harry said nothing. She motioned toward the floating wand. This wand once belonged to a young wizard who asked the same question you're asking now. "Why does my wand no longer follow?" Harry looked down at his own. "I thought maybe I was broken." "No," she said, and her voice was a warm hum in the quiet. "You're changing." And so the wand listens. It does not abandon. It waits. For the wizard to hear himself again, Harry's breath stilled. "You carry echoes of battle, of grief, of triumph, but also now peace, rest, harmony." And the wand does not recognize this song yet. Harry looked at the runes on the old wand floating before him. Did he find his way? The woman smiled. He did. Not with power, not with answers, but with stillness. She reached out and touched the tip of Harry's wand with her finger. Instantly, a faint glow spiraled up the wood, soft green, like new leaves unfolding in spring. The wand pulsed, not brightly, but warmly. "It's beginning," she whispered. Harry looked at her, heart full of questions, but wrapped in calm. "What should I do?" She met his gaze. "Walk slowly, breathe deeply. Remember who you were before the war, before the world made you its savior. Be simply Harry. The wand will listen." And with that, the clearing faded, not into darkness, but into light and breeze and the soft rustle of home. He was standing again in his cottage garden. The moon was rising. His wand, cradled in his palm, felt quiet, but no longer unsure. And as the wind danced gently through the glowing flower beds, Harry smiled, not in triumph, but in peace. The forest, it seemed, was just beginning to share its next story. The next morning dawned with a gentle hush over the valley, the kind of morning that asks for no urgency. A golden mist filtered through the trees, wrapping the garden and cottage in a soft blanket of light. The leaves shimmered with dew, and the distant coo of owls returning to roost seemed to bid farewell to the night. Harry stood at the kitchen window, one hand wrapped around a mug of steaming tea, the other resting on the sill, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath his fingertips. His wand lay on the counter, calm and silent, but no longer distant. It rested there like a friend who had come home, quiet but present. Something had shifted inside him, not in a sudden, jarring way, but in a way that felt like a tide turning, steady, patient, inevitable. That morning, he made a choice, not a grand, world-saving one like in the past, but a quiet one to explore. He stepped out of the cottage, not in robes, not with a plan, but simply with curiosity, the kind he remembered feeling as a boy exploring the grounds of Hogwarts for the first time. Not because someone told him to, but because wonder pulled him forward. The forest welcomed him. He walked past the garden, through the arched stone gate, and down a path he hadn't taken in years. It curled gently between mossy stones and tall grasses, occasionally opening to little glades where butterflies dozed on sun-dappled leaves and birds preened in puddles of light. As he moved deeper into the woods, Harry noticed things he hadn't before. Carvings on trees that looked almost like runes, branches that leaned toward each other as if whispering. There were flowers that closed as he passed, and others that bloomed, just for a moment, as if responding to his presence. He paused near a small stream, its waters singing over smooth stones. Beside it, nestled between roots, was a flat stone with faint etchings. Kneeling, he brushed away the moss. The markings were familiar, not in meaning, but in feeling. They pulsed gently beneath his touch, not dangerous, just old, waiting, a choice. He looked at his wand. Would it answer now? With a breath slow and sure, he raised it, not to cast, not to command, but to connect. Lumos, the light that bloomed, was soft, not the usual beam, but a warm glow, like the first flicker of a fire in a quiet hearth, and the markings on the stone responded. Faint, swirling lines lit up beneath his fingers, and for a moment he saw not words, but images, visions, memories, perhaps even dreams of those who had once stood here, wondering as he did now. He sat by the stream, listening to the water, letting the moment stretch and breathe. Later, as the sun rose higher, Harry wandered toward a grove of silver-barked trees he had glimpsed once from afar. They formed a loose circle, and in the center, resting on an old stone pedestal, was something unexpected. A journal, bound in soft leather, its edges worn. He opened it slowly. Inside were sketches, maps of forest paths, drawings of strange magical creatures, notations on wand reactions, theories of elemental magic. It was someone's study, someone like him, a wizard curious enough to document the magic that didn't live in books or classrooms, but in the quiet corners of the world. A name was etched on the first page, Thessaly Wren, Wand Keeper. Harry had never heard of her, but as he flipped through the pages, He could feel the same pulse he had felt on the stone, a thread weaving through time. He smiled. His choice had brought him here, not for a fight, not for a mystery to solve, but for connection. Back at the cottage that evening, he laid the journal on the table, a new project, a new chapter, not as an horror, not as the boy who lived, just Harry. He lit a fire, made some soup, and sat near the window as the stars came out. Crookshanks leapt onto the windowsill and let out a small, approving grunt. The wand sat beside the journal now, silent but steady. That night, before sleep took him, Harry whispered into the stillness of the cottage, "I think I understand now. It's not about control, it's about harmony." Outside, the wind stirred the chimes on the porch in a slow, magical rhythm, the kind that sounded like the forest exhaling. And in his dreams, the wand no longer hovered uncertain. It walked beside him. The days had grown quieter still. The forest no longer held mystery in its silence. It welcomed Harry into it. And the wand that once shied away from his touch had begun humming gently with magic again. Not with obedience, but something deeper. Understanding. Harry had continued reading Thessaly Wren's journal each evening. The entries were disjointed at times, more sketches and murmured theories than polished spells. But the deeper he read, the more he realized this wasn't a book of answers. It was a book of questions, of wonder, and it reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten, that magic had never been about command, but about connection. One afternoon, a soft breeze swept through the glen. The sky was a soft gray, the kind that asked you to slow down. Harry followed the stream again, past the runic stone, past the silver grove, until he came upon a hidden arch of tangled trees. He had passed by it several times before, but today something urged him to step through. The space beyond the arch felt different. The air shimmered faintly, like the shimmer of heat over stone, though it wasn't warm, and the light had a strange clarity, as if he'd stepped out of time into a moment set aside from the world. At the center of this place stood an ancient statue, a robed witch, wand raised not in battle, but in offering. Moss had grown over her shoulders like a shawl, and ivy curled around her staff. Her face, though worn with age, wore a knowing, patient smile. And in her other hand, outstretched, palm open, lay a hollow, circular basin carved from moonstone. It held no water, but when Harry stepped closer, the basin began to glow with soft light, pulsing like a heartbeat. His wand trembled in his pocket. Very slowly, he drew it. The moment the wand was exposed to the air within that clearing, it pulsed, bright and insistent, and then, to Harry's astonishment, slipped gently from his grasp and floated into the air. He didn't panic. He didn't chase it. Instead, he stood still and watched. The wand hovered over the basin for a long breath and then dipped downward. It touched the light, and the clearing responded. A gentle wave of magic spread out through the trees, a soundless ripple. The basin filled with swirling silver mist, and within it, an image formed. Harry stepped closer, breath caught in his throat. He saw himself, years ago, but not the boy in battle, not the teenager on quests. It was him, much younger, sitting cross-legged in the Gryffindor common room, turning his wand over in his hands, fascinated, curious, no spell, no pressure, just wonder. The image shifted. Now he saw himself teaching at Hogwarts. His brief stint after the war, he remembered how awkward he'd felt, standing in front of students, trying to be wise, when all he wanted was to sit beside them and learn again. He saw flashes of himself in the forest, watching magical creatures with quiet respect. He saw his hands drawing protective runes, not for power, but for safety. And then the image changed again. It was his wand. But instead of being an object, it was almost alive, not a person, not a creature, but something ancient and conscious, not thinking in words, but in feeling. And it had been waiting, not for a better wizard, but for a truer one, a Harry, who wasn't trying to be a hero, or a symbol, or even a teacher. Just Harry, a man still in love with magic. The mist faded. The wand returned to him, lightly, softly, resting in his hand like a feather, and he understood. All this time, it wasn't that the wand had rejected him. It had simply been quiet, waiting for him to remember that magic isn't about what you can do. It's about how deeply you feel it. He had spent so many years trying to prove something to others, to himself. But this moment, this was different. Here, there was no one to impress, no one watching, no danger to overcome. And in that stillness, he found the heart of magic again. A soft wind passed through the trees, and Harry raised his wand, not to cast anything, but to thank it. And for the first time in weeks, he felt its hum, steady, joyful, whole. When he returned to the cottage that evening, something had settled in him. He didn't rush to write in a journal. He didn't feel the need to record it. He simply sat on the porch, tea in hand, and watched the sky melt into stars. The night carried a peace he hadn't known in years. A peace that wasn't granted by victory, but by surrender, to quiet, to presence, to the magic that lives not in spells, but in stillness. Inside, the wand rested on the mantle, calm and gleaming faintly in the firelight. And in his heart, Harry knew he hadn't lost his magic. He had finally come home to it. The days that followed in the cottage unfolded with the gentle rhythm of a clock that had no need to chime. Harry's mornings began not with plans, but with moments, watching dew gather on the windowsill, feeling the warmth of tea seep into his hands, hearing the soft tap of owl wings in the trees above. Something had changed, not in the world around him, but within. The wand no longer hummed unpredictably. It sat quietly now beside his reading chair, not as a weapon or tool, but a companion. There was no need to test it, no urgency to use it. Magic, he realized, didn't need to prove itself. One crisp morning, the sky was painted with long strokes of soft amber and pearl gray. Harry stepped out with a blanket around his shoulders and a steaming cup in hand. The forest greeted him in its usual hush, but now he could hear more. The slow creak of ancient branches, the whisper of leaves settling, the distant hoot of a sleepy owl reluctant to return to its nest. Everything breathed slower here, the kind of slowness that doesn't dull the senses, but deepens them. In that quiet, Harry began to write again. Not for a book, not for history, just thoughts, Musings on magic, not as something to wield, but as something to know. Not a force, but a presence, a companion in silence. He spent afternoons rearranging the cottage, not for practicality, but for comfort. A low shelf by the fire held Thessaly Wren's journal now, alongside a few favorite texts on charms and ancient magical theory. A small pot of ivy crept up the corner, seemingly drawn to the light from the enchanted lamp overhead. When Ron dropped by, unannounced of course, he stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyeing the place with mock suspicion. "You turned this into a retreat, haven't you?" he teased. Harry had only smiled. "Something like that." Ron had nodded, softer then. "Feels good here." It did feel good. Not perfect, not thrilling, but whole. On some evenings, Harry would walk into the clearing where the statue stood, where the moonstone basin still glowed faintly. He never touched it again. But sometimes, he'd sit beside it, leaning against the ancient figure, and listen. Not for prophecy, just for peace. The statue never spoke, but somehow it always understood. And so life continued, not with fanfare, but with steadiness. A kind of steady Harry hadn't known in years. His wand rested easily now. Not every spell worked perfectly. That wasn't the point anymore. What mattered was the feeling behind the magic, that quiet awe, that softness in the chest when you whispered Lumos not to light the way, but just to see your own hand glowing gently in the dark. One day, Hermione sent a letter, not an urgent one, just a thought. She said about how the nature of magic was evolving, and how perhaps some spells weren't refusing to work, but simply inviting wizards to listen differently. Harry read it aloud to the trees and smiled. She always knew how to name the invisible things. By then, the season had begun to shift. The first frost had dusted the garden path, and the trees began their long, slow stretch into winter. Harry chopped wood with lazy rhythm, not because he had to, but because it grounded him. Even the fire crackled in tune with his breath. On the final page of his journal, he wrote only one line: "The wand never disobeyed. I just forgot how to ask softly." Then he closed the cover, not with finality, but with peace. As the stars blinked gently awake overhead, and the quiet wrapped itself around the cottage once more, Harry stood at the window, looking out at the still forest. He didn't feel heroic. He didn't feel powerful. He felt present. And that was magic enough. And now, dear listener, as the forest breathes under a starlit sky, and the embers in Harry's hearth settle into a warm, quiet glow, the tale winds gently to its close. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries don't come from triumph or adventure, but from stillness, from those quiet hours when the world pauses and you're left alone with your thoughts, your wand, and your wonder. Harry didn't seek out a prophecy. He didn't chase down dark magic or ancient secrets. What he found, what he remembered, was far more precious. The magic that listens, the kind that doesn't demand attention, the kind that answers softly when called with patience and respect. So, if you ever feel uncertain, if the path ahead blurs or your own magic feels distant, let this story stay with you. Let it remind you that even the most powerful wand can falter if rushed, that sometimes all you need is to slow down, breathe, and try again with a gentler heart. Like the wind through the trees or the flicker of a single candle, your magic, too, can return quietly, calmly, when the world is still enough to receive it. Tonight, there is no need to solve anything, no riddles to unravel, just the warm memory of a cottage in the woods, a wand resting beside an old journal, and the soft hum of peace finally returning to a wizard who had once carried the weight of the world. Let your breath fall into that same rhythm, slow, steady, safe. Let your mind drift now, held in the comfort of old magic and new understanding. You are in a place where nothing is expected of you, where even the sorting hat would whisper, not with decision, but with care. So close your eyes, my friend. Let Silken take you gently, and know that somewhere beyond the still forest, Harry too is resting, his wand quiet at last, the stars watching over him and over you. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with light, warmth, and the kind of magic that needs no spells at all.